listening to The Tenderness Revolution, a podcast about the stories of kindness, compassion, and empathy that play out in our lives, because these deeply moving experiences describe what it means to be human and invite us into a new way of thinking about the world and each other. I'm your host, writer and journalist Yvonne Gavin. And every episode, I'll be asking a new interviewee about a pivotal moment of tenderness that helped shape the course of their life. Today's conversation is with the author, speaker and photographer Penny Windsor, who was born in Melbourne and now lives in London. Her book, Tender, The Imperfect Art of Caring, love the title, is a powerful, important and beautifully written book that's partly a social commentary on caring, what it is, why it's so essential for the survival of humanity, yet so undervalued, and is woven through with her own experiences of being a carer, firstly to her mum, who suffered with depression throughout Penny's teen years, and now to her son, Arthur, who's 12, and has a learning disability and is autistic. In this episode, we talk about the problems with comparison and perfectionism in society, why we judge others as well as ourselves, self-compassion as the most important thing we can all learn, and where we can find purpose in our lives. So please do take a look at Penny's book. She is a talented author with a couple of more books on the horizon. She also runs wonderful workshops and coaches aspiring authors, has a newsletter and her own podcast, and takes beautiful interiors photos, so do look her up. If you enjoy this conversation, I'd really appreciate you leaving a little review or getting in touch. I think Penny is an incredibly inspiring woman, and I'm sure you will too. Hi, Penny.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to finally have you on the podcast today. And I have to say, I have really, really enjoyed reading your book. Oh my goodness, it really, really resonated with me. So I'm really excited about our conversation today. But before we chat, I just want to start off by asking you if you can share your moment of tenderness with us, because the idea behind the Tenderness Revolution podcast is that essentially our lives are made up of all these little stories stitched together. And when we shine a light on scenes where we felt a profound sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, moments where we felt seen or understood, or that we had a deeper relationship to the world around us, it's as though we're awakened to a greater sense of meaning and purpose. So please do share your moment with us.
Oh, this is a tricky one. I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about really when I've learned to have tenderness towards myself, which I think has been one of the trickiest things in life to learn. And I'm sure lots of people will feel quite similar. I remember really when I started realizing that I didn't have to, when things went wrong, and particularly in the case of I'm a carer to my son who is autistic and has a learning disability. And I think when it really finally clicked that that I was going to do things wrong and things were going to go wrong, and that I didn't then need to beat myself up on top of it. And I remember it really, really clearly. I remember just, I guess, a sense of release, like, oh, actually, I guess treating myself with tenderness and treating myself with kindness when I do something wrong is actually the way forward. I know it might sound really strange, but I realized that when I made a mistake with him, and when I make a mistake with my son, it can feel quite catastrophic. And when I say mistake, I mean accidentally doing something in the wrong order, which leads to a meltdown, something that I could have easily avoided. They're the things I used to beat myself up the most about. Something really small that I could have avoided that then meant the day just kind of went kind of way out of control. And when I really learned that I didn't have to do that, that I could let those moments happen and offer both my son and me compassion in those moments, it just suddenly realized that I could let them go. And as soon as I'm able to let them go, we can get on with our day and it doesn't have to ruin our whole day. And part of that came from looking at how my son was able to let things go. When he loses it, he can really lose it and you can really see him physically go into fight or flight. And when he gets into that position, like when we all do in a way, you almost need to just let it pass through. You can't stop it at some points, it just has to happen. And then I would notice that actually he recovered really well from these moments. Like, half an hour later, he could be really happy playing in the garden. He might have used up a lot of emotional capacity that day. So he might be prone to it happening again later because he's maybe quite depleted from it. But at the same time, he was really quite well recovered. And I remember looking at him going, how does he do that? And in a way, I think it's similar to how he's able to let go of a lot of things rather than always hold on to them. And so partly I was able to learn that from watching him, and partly just from understanding more about compassion and how it's not finite, and how if I use it on myself, I don't run out of it. Because I think that's what I used to worry about in those moments when my son was having a really hard time. I thought at first, if I offered myself compassion in those moments, that I was using up the compassion for me instead of him, which felt really selfish because, of course, it's so difficult for him to be having a meltdown. It's awful. It's much worse for him to be experiencing it than it is for me. And so I used to think that I would be somehow taking it away from him. But actually, through the research I did and the reading, there really is a lot of evidence to show that the more compassion you have for yourself, the more you have for other people as well. And so you're almost like growing it by giving yourself compassion. Yeah.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And I love self-compassion. It's a big interest of mine, and I loved your chapter on it in the book. And I'm really familiar with Kristen Neff's work as well. And I did that course, the Mindful Self-Compassion course, and it really changed so much for me. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think it's one of the most tender things that we can do in life, to have that compassion for ourselves. I don't know if you talked about this story in your book, but it really hit me the first time I heard Kristen Neff describe how when she was with her autistic son on an aeroplane and he was having a meltdown, and she tried to put she thought she'd experiment and try put this self-compassion into practice, and what it looked like was, like you're saying, is that sense of, this is really, really hard for him, and it's really hard for me too, and it's okay because I'm doing my best and he's struggling. And it was so powerful to me, like hearing that. It's exactly what you're saying. It's like and there's that thing, isn't there, in Buddhism, the second arrowing. It's like where they have this difficult thing, and then the second arrow is feeling bad about that difficult thing. It is hard, actually. This thing that I've experienced is hard, and it's okay. It's okay. And it's massive. I believe that it could change the world if we could afford to talk to ourselves like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it is also a practice, and I'm not always very good at it. So it's funny because I've written about it and I feel really strongly about it, but it's still difficult to do. And I don't think it's difficult to talk kindly to myself anymore. It's not that I never have a harsh inner word for myself, but it's very easy to turn away from that now. I find it really easy to find my compassionate voice. But what I still struggle with is in those very difficult moments when my son is completely flipped out, remaining very calm can still be difficult. But I have got very good at the afterwards, the kind of not spending the rest of the day beating myself up because I put a water glass in the way, which meant he kicked it over, and then he had a meltdown because his feet were wet or something, those kinds of things. I'm much better at letting go and focusing on just reconnecting with him. But yeah, I mean, we had an incident yesterday, and it was the first incident we've had in a little while about going to school, just because we're coming up to the Easter holidays here, and he's really tired and he's ready for Easter break. And it's funny, like I really didn't react very well to it. Like I found myself being really impatient and really really, really wound up about it. And then I realized afterwards, often that can happen when I've got too much going on and my capacity is really low, but that isn't the case at the moment. I'm very busy, but I'm not like emotionally stressed at the moment, particularly just very busy. So I was trying to figure out what it was that really triggered me in that moment, like why I struggled to find calm. And I realized it was because sometimes when he has a big melt down like that, and we haven't had one for a while, I get really, really scared because I'm like, oh, we're going down this road again.
Oh, yeah.
And in a way, that's the thing about the mindful self-compassion that's so useful, is that because it's really trying to get you to be just now. Like I wasn't even conscious that was why I was not coping very well, but I realized maybe an hour later that that's what it was. Because it is scary, because my son is now 12 and he's going to be bigger than me soon. And so a violent meltdown is starting, I can see that it's going to start being physically quite scary for both of us. Because of course it's terrible for my son because he literally can't control himself in those moments. So, and he feels awful about them afterwards. But, so it's, it is scary. It's scary that those things still happen. And once I'd sort of that had clicked into place, an hour or so later, I was able to just be like, you know what, like it is scary and it's okay to be scared about that. But also I have to work on reminding myself not to bring those fears into the moment, because I don't have to deal with the future in that moment. I only have to deal with that moment. And so I do need to, it's still hard. Like it's still a big practice to kind of remind yourself only to deal with the moment in front of you and not all of the potential future moments as well. Exactly. It's really tricky practice.
It's really tricky, but you articulate it so beautifully. It's all of those things. It's that, I mean, I suppose I remember the moment when I realized it's about partly realizing what is it that's driving this reaction. Like, so you said, it's this fear of the future. So you get better at noticing those things.
You do. Yeah.
And then when you work it out, like as you did, you're like, it's okay to feel scared about the future because it is hard. So I feel for that. Like I give myself compassion for finding it hard. And you just have this, this internal, like, oh, thank you.
Yeah. Like a letting go. You can just start to unwind a bit about it. Yeah. Yeah.
And it just feels so nice to have that, that kindness, show that kindness to those difficult things, acknowledge the difficult thing, and then, show yourself kindness for it, like the way you would with a friend. I remember you describing that in your book, realizing that, well, this is how I would talk to a friend that was finding something hard. I can talk to myself like that too, but there is a resistance to it. I've spoken to people about it before, and I've had reactions like, well, yeah, but then how would I ever do anything? I mean, I wouldn't do anything if I was to always be kind to myself.
Yeah, and I think that's a misunderstanding about what motivates us as humans. I think we've often been brought up in very kind of in cultures where it's expected, in classrooms, for instance, where it's expected that you need a punishment in order to not do something wrong. You need to have, that you somehow always have to have a deadline. You always have to have a punishment just in case you decide to suddenly be a terrible person, whatever it is. And obviously that's just one way of looking at humans. And it's actually not necessarily the case. I mean, I actually, as a parent, I have never used punishment. Not that my children get to do whatever they want, but people often think that's what it means. But it just means that we have boundaries instead of arbitrary punishments. So because I truly don't think people are their best in when they're treating themselves or treating others really badly. I just don't think we're at our best. I think we're at our best when we feel supported, but also, and are shown kindness, but also are given boundaries and conditions to work within and everything. But yeah, I just don't think we're at our best when we speak harshly to anyone, and especially ourselves.
Yeah, and actually it connects to, you know, this like concept of basic goodness. I think it connects to that, you know, for me, and also this thing about not punishing, which is, well, ultimately we're all just good underneath, like that's our true nature. So if you kind of recognize that and come from that place, rather than a place of, well, really you're like bad underneath and you're going to revert to that badness. If definitely. I don't keep you in this, if I don't make, you know, contain you, you're just going to be bad.
So, it's this idea of which I think Brene Brown has talked about in some of her earlier books, this idea that you know, whether or not you believe that people are genuinely doing the best they can in any moment, which I do genuinely believe, and that doesn't mean that people aren't doing things wrong or doing things they shouldn't, but they're coping and doing what they can in that moment, and I genuinely believe that. And so I think if we can give people the opportunity to thrive, if we can, then that's what they will do. And also still make mistakes along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, like you said, that belief, if you hold that as your value, I do think that shapes the way you approach the world. And I think, you know, historically there has been another approach, which is more of a fear-based sort of one. And I think that, you know, that along with this sense that, you know, as you just really beautifully explained, you know, people have stuff, like they're carrying all kinds of crap, you know, they're carrying, you know, all these difficult experiences they've had and stuff that they're, you know, they've been subjected to, or belief systems that they've been handed. That's what stops people from behaving in the best possible way, not who they ultimately are, but it's the stuff, you know, that people carry around. But I don't think that many people really think about the world in that way. But, you know,
I mean, I think we find our ways of coping with the hand we've been dealt in life, don't we? And they can be, those coping mechanisms can be really positive and or really negative, or probably mostly a mixture of both, depending on whether or not we still need those coping mechanisms anymore. But to kind of, in a way, blame ourselves for developing these coping systems in the first place, I think is sort of like, there's no point in doing that. We've done what we've done to survive in whatever imperfect situations we've been in. And I think, you know, I've really noticed that about myself, you know, I think how I reacted to the lockdowns, for instance, was really interesting, because, and I spoke to quite a few other parents of disabled children about how they reacted to it as well. A lot of us did react quite like very fearfully, because there's so much that we had to lose in a way.
Understand.
And I remember thinking, like, God, why can't I just like chill out and accept that this is happening? And I was like, sort of went into overdrive doing and making sure that I did as much as I could to protect myself during that time. And then I've just realized, well, I mean, actually, there's a really good reason. There's a really good reason that I kind of go into overdrive when things go wrong. Because I've, you know, things have happened in my life that have gone wrong, and I've coped with them by over functioning. And it's sort of I can, again, try and be compassionate that that's sometimes how I react, because, you know, the pandemic was not my first rodeo. It was the first of that kind, but it's certainly not the most difficult thing that's happened in my life. It's just, it certainly compounded a lot of tricky things. But yeah, you almost have to kind of be a bit more compassionate about your coping mechanisms as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's that thing of awareness, isn't it? And you're, you know, one of the things that comes across in your book is you're so self-aware, you know, and you are aware of when, you know, you're so honest as well. You're honest, and then you have this awareness of this difficult thing. That's what it was. And then the compassion, which is always what's needed, I think. always. But I wanted to sort of talk a bit to start with about just, you know, the subject of caring. I mean, your book really stood out to me as the social commentary that we all desperately need to read. I mean, there are just so many powerful statistics in there, just how undervalued but utterly essential, you know, caring is to the survival of humanity and the economy. You know, you said, I think between birth and death, the one thing we all know is that life will feature care, you know. So obviously women come out really badly in all of this. Women do 75% of all unpaid work. In the US alone, that really interesting statistic about the cost of unpaid care being provided was $450 billion, the same as Walmart's annual sales figures. So it's sort of like the taboo, the thing that people don't really want to admit or talk about. And one of the things I love is that I feel like your book, it provides a sort of a map for both the internal and external work that needs to be done to sort of fully understand and appreciate what caring is and how we can help each other to do it. So, I mean, I really love talking about all the internal stuff, but in terms of the external world, just to start off, you know, what would you like to sort of articulate is the first thing, do you think, that needs to change in the external world?
I think it's quite complex, but I think essentially some really concrete things that could change quite easily if there was, you know, impetus and willing to do so is, I mean, that in the UK, there is an absolute crisis in the care industry. I mean, it was a crisis before the pandemic, and there's been such a huge surge of need for care during the pandemic. But, you know, there needs to be proper funding of care. I think a lot of people, in some ways, I don't know, either don't understand or perhaps partially have their head in the sand about the NHS does not provide care. It doesn't. It helps people when they're sick and dying. It does not provide care. The need for proper funded care, properly funded care system is just, I mean, it's just absolutely crucial. Because at the moment, and still to this day, gosh, I mean, I think it was like Rishi Sunak, you know, just this past year was sort of saying, yes, well, the first port of call for anyone who needs care should be their immediate family. And, you know, this is still being perpetuated. And of course, people want to provide care for their loved ones. They absolutely do. And in fact, every single person I interviewed for the book, they didn't want to not be doing it, but they had too much put upon them. And it wasn't possible to do what they were doing without huge sacrifice, life-changing sacrifices. You know, women are the one of the poorest groups of people in society are older women, because they haven't been able to pay into pensions. And that's because they've been caring for children and then caring for all the other family members. Because once you're already have spent time out of the workforce caring for children, you are the go-to person then to care for all the other family members who become unwell as they get older. You know, it leaves women in poverty. And although men are doing more and more caring now, they really are. Women live a long time as well. They provide care, but they also receive care. A lot of the care done by men is after they finish working. So after retirement age, that's when a lot of them are stepping up. And so although they're making a massive contribution, they often have not made the same sacrifices throughout their working lives that women have made. And so that's where it's still a very gendered issue, even though if you look statistically, I think it's something like 58 or 59% of carers are women, and 40 something percent are men. So you think, oh, that's not bad. But when you look at the numbers, actually, anyone providing care of more than 35 hours a week, it's 70% or 75% women who are doing that.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the big hours, the amount of hours, and also for the number of years, it's usually women doing those longer ones. So I think immediately having a proper funded care system is the most immediate and totally possible, fixable kind of thing. And so anyone who wants to do it has the support in place to keep doing it as long as possible. Because that's the other thing as well, is that it's not necessarily for short periods of time. Often it's for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And so it's making it as I guess, like providing the support for both the person who needs care and for the other people in their lives providing that care, so that it can go on as long as
they can sustain it.
So they can sustain it.
Yeah. And that just makes so much sense. And young carers, that's another really, really interesting subject that you touch on a lot. And I mean, you obviously have personal experience of that. So were you about 13 when you started sort of caring for your mum in that way, or when she
well, it sort of happened a bit over time. She first started becoming unwell when I was 11. But I would say by the time I was about 13, I had a lot of caring responsibilities, although I didn't know that's what it was at the time.
Yeah.
And I didn't know until many years after she died that that's what I was, that I was a young carer. It's something I think is so important to talk about, because even carers of any age really struggle to identify themselves as carers. And it's really, really important, because it's the first stage of accepting that that's what you're doing is the first step towards being able to reach out and get more support that you might need in order to continue doing it. But young carers particularly, it's really hard to identify them. Often families are not necessarily open and honest about how much care a child is providing, because perhaps of some feelings of shame around it, that it shouldn't be happening. So it's not necessarily always easy to spot. And I certainly didn't think that's what I was doing. I just thought, well, I'm just being a daughter. But I think the thing that's interesting about young carers particularly is there's two sort of sides to it. One is that they are providing care for somebody else in the family, and the other is that they're possibly missing out on care for themselves, because they're the ones who are taking the more kind of parental role in the family. And so there's sort of two sides to that. It is identifying as a carer is really, really important. And part of the reason why I talk about my experiences caring for my mum and now for my son, because although of course I'm first and foremost a mother, I am also an unpaid carer. And the reason it's important to articulate that difference, because I know I often get asked this, because a lot of parents feel really complicated feelings about using the word carer. The reason I think it's really important, the reason I suggest people use that term and get comfortable with the term, is partly because when we accept that what we're doing is above and beyond regular parenting, we can also accept that we might need support beyond what a typical parent might receive. And I think that's really, really, really crucial. The other reason why I think it's really important is because I think we have a difficulty with the word carer, and partly that's because we have there's a few reasons, but I think partly that's because we have difficulty with the word disabled. And accepting you're a carer is accepting that the person that you love is disabled. And that can be really difficult for people. And I get that. And it can take quite a long time to get your head around that. But I think it's really important, because I think we need to not use euphemisms around disability. There's absolutely no shame in being disabled. There's nothing wrong with being disabled. It can be very difficult and very challenging to live with for multiple reasons, many of which are societal, but not always. Often a disability comes with, chronic pain or something like that, which is incredibly difficult. But there's nothing wrong with it in and of itself. It is just what it is.
It is, yeah.
And so in a way, embracing the word carer is also embracing the word disability, which I think is really important, particularly when you're raising a disabled child, so that they understand that there is nothing to be ashamed of in being disabled.
That makes me think about your chapter on ableism, and I was fascinated with that whole discussion and the way that you brought so many different things into it. The way you talked about reference points, that was really, really interesting. The way that people who have babies who are considered disabled at birth, the way that they're spoken to, the way that news is presented to them, the way you talked about this thing of other people's perceptions, judgment, pity, and the benchmarks, the way that obviously this thing of comparison. But one thing that really stands out was when you described when Arthur went to a mainstream school for a while, and the way that they kept referring to these benchmarks and the fact that he hadn't met them. And it's just this sense of there's a child who is normal and is the perfect child or the healthy child or whatever, and actually it's not even true. There isn't even any such thing.
Some imaginary perfect child.
It doesn't exist. Like there isn't actually. And then there's so much, there's always even parents of children who don't have a disability always want to know, well, how does my child compare and where do they fit in, and are they in the higher end or the lower end or in the middle? So it just made me think a lot about difference and disability, and how we think about differences and how we think, as you were saying, about disability. And I was just wondering if actually it's just a lack of imagination. It's just like, that's the problem. There's a beautiful book that I've been reading by John Kabat-Zinn, who's a sort of a meditation teacher, called Falling Awake. And there's this part where he talks about different sensory experiences in relation to mindfulness. And actually, he's talking about aliveness, like what does it really mean to be alive? And it made me think about disability and how we're so limited in our understanding of different perceptual experiences. And I think that's part of the problem. That's partly why there's so much fear around disability, or there's so much lack of understanding. He talked about Helen Keller, the famous American disability rights activist who lost her hearing and sight when she was almost 2. She recognized people by scent. She had this amazing ability to kind of to be able to smell and actually learn and understand so much about a person by other means, other than the senses that we sort of rely on. And there's a theologian, John Hull, who lost his sight in his late 40s. And he described how he became a whole body seer. So he shifted his attention of gravity to other senses. So he described this experience of rain and the way that it delineated a whole landscape for him. Just the way that the sound of rain falling on different surfaces made him feel, as though he was there. And it brought him a sense of perception that he didn't have before he lost his sight. And these kind of experiences, I don't think we consider them. I don't think that we use our imaginations enough in relation to experiences of aliveness.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly it's a lack of imagination. I think that's a good way of putting it. But I also think it's because traditionally disabled people have not had a voice and have not been able to share these experiences. And so I think really what we can all do to help change these perceptions is to read the work of disabled writers, watch their films. I mean, Coda was just incredible, and it's just won an Academy Award, and it is just such a celebration of deaf culture, in a way that, unless you're lucky enough to have deaf people in your life, you might not ever experience necessarily. And so I think, through art and through literature and all these different things, if we can turn to people with different experiences, then we can understand it. So yeah, partly it's a lack of imagination, but partly it's also that we haven't been, as a society, haven't really given disabled people the opportunity to kind of create art and to share their experiences. I think it's the kind of, for anyone listening that has a disabled child or has a disabled child in their life, perhaps they're a teacher or, have nieces and nephews or something. I think the best thing that you can do is to turn to disabled people and to understand what the experience is as it's lived, rather than projecting what you think it's going to be like. Because I think I've heard lots of disabled writers write about this and talk about this, disabled actors talk about this idea that when stories are told from the perspective and the point of view of a non-disabled person, there is always going to be this sense of like the disability is the problem, that it's a shame, it's a thing, it's a deficit, it's a, but when it's from the perspective of somebody with that lived experience, for many disabled people, it's their only experience. They might have had a disability for their entire lives, and so as far as they're concerned, they're like, it's just something that they live with, in the same way that I live with being a woman. It's my experience of being in the world, and I can't separate myself from that experience. It's how I've always experienced it. So I think that's where, we all have a role to play by looking for those stories and seeing them, and for that art.
Definitely those stories. And what you were saying there as well, it makes me think though about judgment. That was something else that I thought was brilliant in your book, the way you articulated it, and the fact that, generally the society we live in does have a this sense of scarcity, this never enough, this lack, and comparing is a big part of it. And I love the way you even admitted that you would often question others, even yourself, especially before you had Arthur. And it's a human tendency, this thing of blame. I think it really connects to control, and the fact that it's very, very scary to let go. And then there's this black and white thinking, this sense that everything is either or, good or bad. And I love the way you described parenting. And I just think all experiences of parenting, all experiences of life really is all of it. Like, it's everything. It's unbelievably hard and amazing. And I don't know why do you think it's so hard for us to accept all the difficult bits are what make the good bits amazing? Because that's something that you talk about.
It is. And you know what was interesting when I started doing reading around this, because that fascinates me as well. Why do we struggle to accept that there are some really difficult things that happen when you're a parent, and when you love anyone, right? With your partner or your parents or your siblings and your children or whoever, right?
Absolutely.
I think it was so interesting to me when I found this work, and I can't remember who it's. Gosh, sorry, I can't remember who did which psychologist did the work. But there's a lot of really interesting research about how humans are really, really underestimate their capacity for what they can deal with. I mean, we're terrible at it. We're terrible about underestimating ourselves. We don't think we can cope with anything, and we can cope with an awful lot. We really can, but we really don't believe that we're going to be able to, so I mean, I was even just thinking, I think about this regularly. Thank God I don't know what's coming for me. I don't want to know, because I know that when the time comes and things happen and they go wrong, and they will, because we're human, and they will, there's some, I love a lot of people. Things are going to happen to them or to me. It's inevitable. I don't want to know, because I know that I'll just deal with it as it comes. I just have to deal with it as it comes. And I look back and I think about all the things that I've coped with over the years with, my mum dying, and well, first caring for her and then her dying. Then, even just things like, the kind of terrorism that I've witnessed, and, getting divorced, and childbirth, and, child diagnosis, and the pandemic, and all the things. But of course, I coped with all those things over a period of time, one day at a time.
Yes.
I didn't, like, if you think about it all in one go, it's like, oh no, that's just too overwhelming. Yeah. But actually, you just cope with one thing at a time, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, if necessary. And we actually have amazing capacity to cope with things as humans, even though it doesn't always feel like it, but we do.
And you, I think, out of anyone, can really say that with some authenticity. I mean, just that list that you reeled off. But I think, that's like a tendency to catastrophize and to sort of think, to ahead, or this might happen and that might happen and this might happen, and how will I cope? But actually, it's almost like you're talking about presence. You're saying, well, if I just come back to presence, and I'm like, well, if I just be here and I live this experience I'm having now, then everything will be okay if we keep coming back to presence.
Yeah. And I think as well, we get a bit caught up in how things should look and feel. And it causes us a lot of suffering. And, if we can get better at letting those go, we can really live a lot more happily. I mean, my son is 12. I still lie with him as he's falling asleep. And if I say that to a parent of typical children, they'd just be like, what, at 12? And also, for a good hour and a half. And actually, I just accepted it quite a long time ago. I mean, it would be nice if I wasn't doing it in the future. If he gets to the point when he's, maybe when he's 14 or 15, he won't need me to do that anymore. That would be amazing. And I look forward to that if it happens. But at the same time, I have accepted that this is how we do things in our house. And yeah, it's different to how other people do things. But if I get caught up in the idea that no one else has to do this, which is not true, I know there are families out there doing the same thing I'm doing, then, you cause yourself more suffering. With that particular situation, how I cope with it is that I really love audiobooks. So I just listen to an audiobook when I'm lying with him, and I just get ready for bed at the same time as him. And so as soon as he's asleep, then I get up and I go to my own bed and I just go straight to bed. But it means that I have no time for myself in the evenings, because it's all, obviously he's 12, and so he goes to bed a lot later now and things. It's fine. I have to just put other things in place instead to make sure that I get time I need. Doesn't mean I always love it, but I have accepted that that's just how things are.
Yeah. I know. I think the concept of, surrendering to, the moment or the as is, as opposed to controlling, it's something that I think, you've had to become good at as, a carer. I don't think it's something that comes easily. I think the thing of control it's very difficult for people to relinquish that.
And I see it in other parts of my life. I really try and get a lot of control. So like I was saying earlier, like I have a tendency to overfunction when things go wrong. So just to give an example, in the pandemic, because I spent, spent 15 years as a photographer, and I lost all my work in the pandemic. And it became clear as the pandemic went on, after that first initial 4 months that we had in lockdown in London, where I couldn't shoot at all. It was against the law. It was when I was bringing Tender out. So I had a huge amount of work to do around the book. So I was doing a bit of, I was writing articles and I was doing a few bits and pieces, but I really realized that it was potentially going to be a big problem going back again. And it was actually, my son lost his regular transport to school. We had to be put onto a different system. So actually I lost an hour a day, and it just basically means I can't be on set when I need to be on set. And, photography is not flexible in lots of ways, even though I'm freelance. And so actually over those first 6 months of the pandemic, I realized that, I wasn't going back to that kind of work. It wasn't tenable anymore. The systems I'd spent years putting in place as a single parent with 2 kids in 2 different schools, and my son's special school's quite far away and everything, it just my system all fell apart, and it wasn't going to go back. So it has completely changed what I've done for work. And so I ended up retraining. I've now almost finished the master's. I'm doing all kinds of other things. And people are like, but hang on, you're a single parent and it was a pandemic and you just went and did that. And this is me trying to get the tiny bits of control that I know I need. Like, I can't control everything. I can't control my son's disability. I can't control the pandemic. I can't necessarily control that the local authority took the transport away that made it function. I can't control that our amazing, amazing nanny who I had, who I was able to get a rebate from because she was Ofsted registered. She had to retire because she had got long COVID, and I now can't get anyone to replace her under that system. I mean, those are things I can't control. They're outside of my control. But what I could control was how I could change things to be able to make a living in a different kind of way, in a way that felt good to me, but in a way that could support us and could be done flexibly and all these things. So that is where my control comes in. It's like I scratch around to find the bits I can control, and I really control them. So it sounds like I'm very like, oh, everything's fine, I can let go. I can let go of the things I know I absolutely have to, which I have zero control over, like my son's bedtime thing. I really don't have control over that. But the things that I do have some control over, boy, do I try and control them.
But that's like a superpower. Like, really, how did you do that? I mean, I'm just absolutely in awe of what you've managed to achieve.
I think somebody asked, and another parent carer that I know asked me that, he said to me, you could have literally just spent the last 2 years like watching Netflix. That's how a lot of people have coped with this. And I was like, no, actually I couldn't. I would have been miserable. Actually, this is work that I really love. I find it incredibly stimulating and life-giving. It gives me energy. It doesn't take away from me. I mean, yes, I've been very stretched thin by my various different responsibilities, but at the same time, I did it because it felt good to do it. It wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, some people have done other things because it felt good and right to do those things. But this is something that has, it gives me energy. I realized over the course of the pandemic, work is so vital to me. Not just the actual work that I do, but the ability to access work is so important to me. I have been freelance for like 20 years, and paying into my pension is so important to me. It's so important. It feels like the biggest act of self-care I can do for myself is to pay into my pension. And the thing I need for my emotional and physical well-being is to know that I can pay my bills and look after my children, and also put a little bit away for my future. It's more important to me than, going to yoga and having a bath or whatever else is sort of recommended. It's good for my self-care. I think something as basic as being able to access work is often left out of the conversation when it comes to women being able to care for themselves.
Very interesting. I mean, I've heard you speak about this really beautifully before, and in opposition to that sort of that tendency that anything beyond survival is shameful, because obviously there's the surviving part to work for you, but there's also the the meaning and the purpose.
Yeah. And the self-realization you get through doing work that you feel connected to, like you doing this podcast, you don't have to be doing it, you're choosing. And I'm sure it's a lot of work doing a podcast. I know I also have a podcast.
Yes.
It's a huge amount of work, but it's work that, is life-giving, right? It gives you something as well as you giving outwards to the world, it goes both directions.
It does. And it's interesting how that can often be difficult for people to understand, because I think work is often reduced to just a way that you pay your bills. And I absolutely applaud, that too. I mean, working to live is a very, real aspect of many, many people's lives, but they may find purpose elsewhere. And I love the way you talk about purpose. So that's another chapter in your book. And I think it's actually almost like our life's work is to find what our purpose is. It's such an important thing. So I love the way you talk about the difference between purpose and happiness. So in relation to, there's been so many studies where people who have done some form of care or who've helped others have found this sense of purpose from that work, even though it might not be something people would imagine would give you that. And there's this difference then between joy and happiness. Happiness is this sort of ephemeral thing that we're all hoping to find in our lives or cultivate in our lives, but actually joy is like a sort of a deeper version of that. And I'm really interested in how you found your purpose, because despite everything that you've had to contend with, I mean, there's been so much from when you were very young. And I know that Elizabeth Gilbert's talked about purpose is very much connected to curiosity. So just like follow your curiosity. But I wanted to know from you, like, how did you find your purpose? And, how can the listeners find purpose through sort of your journey?
I think, first of all, when it's said like that, it almost doesn't feel quite right to me, because it almost sounds as if then everybody has a purpose, which I don't think necessarily is true. I think different people will have different bits of purpose at different phases in their lives, and they might have also multiple purposes as well. I guess you could look at purpose as like your reason to get up in the morning. And it's funny, the reason I was thinking about it so much was partly because I remember someone sort of saying to me that, I assume, especially when my son moved to a specialist school, which is an incredible school and he was so lucky he could get into, someone said something like, you must have something like, almost like, and they didn't phrase it like this, but basically I said, you must have lower expectations for him, for his life now, because it's, and I can't remember how they phrased it, but that was basically what they were saying. And I was like, actually, no, I have the same expectations that I've always had, which is that I want him to have a life that is filled with purpose and lots of opportunity for joy and connection with other people. I mean, that's exactly what I want for my daughter. And how it manifests in each of them is going to be completely different. Let's be honest, it will be really different. That's fine. My daughter's purpose might involve, at the moment she wants to be an animator, but my son won't do stuff like that probably. But what I want for him is a sense of purpose, whether that's, he ends up, I don't know, singing in a choir or something like that, right? Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be that you sing in a choir and that is one of the things that drives you, the way that your choir kind of, entertains people and, and helps them feel certain things or whatever it is. Or it might be that, in fact, I have lots of friends who really felt so about their careers and they had children and they suddenly felt a much more renewed sense of purpose because they actually had never really found that in their work. Their work was fine and earned them a living and they were quite proud that they could do that maybe, but didn't feel particularly purposeful. So suddenly becoming a parent felt very purposeful because, the things that you did mattered, the things, the care that you provide another person matters in quite a significant way. So I think we can get purpose in multiple different ways across our life. So I would say that first of all. I don't think we have one single purpose. And so I guess it's I very much do believe, in a similar way to Elizabeth Gilbert, this idea that of following your curiosity. It's how I've always functioned. I don't think I've always had, I'm not a 5-year plan kind of person. I might think about the next year or two. I might have a few ideas for what I might want in the future, but no kind of, 20-step plan to get to XYZ goal. I have always followed my curiosity, and that's taken me in some interesting directions. And now that I'm in my 40s and I can look back and see where my curiosity has taken me, I can see the path. But I don't think it's necessarily something you can always see in advance. But I have learned to trust that when I become deeply interested in something, that I can trust that and I can follow and see where it takes me.
But it feels like you're talking about almost like a trust in, like a thread that runs through life, that you believe that there's this almost like if you can kind of connect to that, it will take you where you're supposed to go.
Well, I think you create that thread yourself. And I think if you can trust in your own curiosity, it will take you in very interesting places. I think, sometimes I've spent time with friends who agonize over the next step. Should I apply for that job? And they become almost like paralyzed with not being able to know what the next thing is, because it has to be the right next step.
Because they're afraid they'll make the wrong choice. Yeah,
exactly. And I've always completely dismissed that. And I have literally just taken the next step that I was most curious about. And I think it takes it does take a lot to trust in yourself. I think because I sort of started doing that quite young, I would say, in my teenage years, one of the things that happened, I wrote about this in the book, actually. One of the things that happened was that when things got really bad, she had really severe depression and alcoholism. And when I was 14, things were really bad. She was in and out of hospital a lot. My dad lived in another country, and we were really lucky. My mum was quite well supported in that she paid someone to come, like a paid carer to come a couple of afternoons, 2 or 3 afternoons a week, check in on us, do a bit of cleaning, put a casserole in the fridge for us, that kind of thing. So we were certainly not alone. And we had some extended family checking in, but we were on our own in the house with her. And, I was always making sure she ate and trying to get her out of bed, doing everything for myself as well, and that kind of thing. But it was that year when I was 14 was bad, and she attempted suicide a couple of times and was in and out of hospital a lot. And at the end of that year, I decided I just couldn't. I felt like I was drowning completely. And so I asked my dad if he would support my decision if I wanted to go away to boarding school, and he was very supportive. And it was really difficult because my mum really didn't want me to go.
I'm reading about it in the book.
Yeah, she really, really didn't want me to go. She was really devastated, and it was a big risk to do. Because she was threatening suicide and all sorts of things, and obviously and it was a genuine risk that if I made this decision, that it might have quite a big impact on my mum. But with the support of my extended family, who really agreed that I should do it, I did it. And it turned out to be a really great decision. And my mum did come around to the idea and could see that it was the right decision for me, and she was in the end really glad that I'd done it. Not always. She went back and forth quite a lot over the years. It came up a lot when she was drunk. But it's funny. I looked back. I remember when I got divorced, actually, I saw a therapist. The only time actually that I've seen a therapist is around when I got divorced, and I hadn't in all those years. And we sort of were talking about that decision and how it was a decision that actually I learned to trust my instincts. I don't know what made me make that decision then. I don't know what made me brave enough to do it. But because it worked, in a sense, I saw, I got support for that decision. not from my mum, but from other people. And because actually I really did then thrive, because I would still look back, I would consider what I was doing still caring. I was sort of, on the phone with my mum quite a bit. I went back for some weekends. I was there every holiday. So I was still very much, caring for her, but just in a more, I was able to remove myself and protect myself quite a bit more and have a bit more control over when that happened. I could control when I had phone calls with her. If I knew I had exams that day, I wouldn't speak to her till the evening, things like that, whereas obviously at home, you couldn't put those boundaries in place. So I think that decision did teach me to trust my instincts.
Your intuition. It was like you did that. You listened and you.
Yeah. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s that I could sort of pinpoint that as a sort of starting point of me learning to trust myself. And I was really fortunate and in a very, very privileged position, I should add, that my family could afford to, but also even more than that, actually supported me doing it, because I know a lot of families would not have supported that decision. So it was a big turning point in my life, I think. And then I've since that age, made all my own decisions for myself entirely. And, where I went to university, how long I actually ended up choosing to go. I lived at home during university. That was my choice. I wasn't going to be made to do it by anybody. I've lived in a number of different countries. I've always worked for myself. So really, I'd say from 14, I have made all of my own decisions, and I'll, listen to what my dad has to say. I'm curious about his thoughts, and my mum, when she was alive, I would want her opinion, but I very much made all my own decisions from that point. So I guess I got a lot of practice at following what I was curious about, but also trusting my instincts. And I know that's not the case for a lot of people. A lot of people don't feel like they can trust their instincts. But so I would say it takes a lot of practice. And maybe, and I've heard another writer who writes about creativity, Twyla Tharp. She wrote a book called, I think it's called The Creativity Habit, or The Creative Habit. And she looks at creativity as a habit that you have to grow over time. And I think I very much agree with that line of thought as well, which is that, following your curiosity has to be practiced. It has to be a part of your kind of everyday life, is to have that in your life. And so one thing I think that can be really useful is when you're making small creative decisions, small decisions to follow your curiosity, tune in and see how it feels in your body when you're making those decisions, and just start noticing how it feels, because I can do that. When I need to make a big decision, like for instance, when I decided to borrow a load of money to go and do a master's degree, I had to, when I was thinking about it, I kind of really tuned into how it felt. If I thought about making that decision and everything that decision meant, taking on debt, but also the time involved and the work itself and all those different things, and sort of really tuning into your body and how you react to those, the details can be helpful. I can be a really good practice.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely a brilliant practice, and really quite so inspiring that you were able to know that. I mean, it makes me wonder about, I think there's so much hope in your book. It's a very strong feeling that comes through, and it makes me wonder what you think about, a glass half empty or a glass half full kind of person. I mean, do you think that you were born with that hope that has been abiding despite challenge after challenge that's been thrown your way? You continually come out with this sense of hope for something to really go right, like something good's gonna happen next. And Where does that come from?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I honestly don't know whether it's something that you're born with or something you cultivate. I suspect it's a bit of both. Like a lot of personality stuff, I think it's a mixture, isn't it? I don't know. I think there's probably a bit of contention about how much personality you're born with and how much is cultivated by your, family and society and everything. I suspect it's a bit of both.
Yeah. I mean, I before I had children, I used to put a lot more emphasis on environment. And I used to think, we're very much shaped by our experiences. But then when I actually gave birth to these humans, and I was so shocked.
Their personalities. Yeah.
I was shocked because the moment they're born, like even now, like I look at all three of my children, I look at them now and I'm like, you are exactly who you were the moment you were born. Like you are the same person. Things have happened to you, but your being, your nature was there. It was like 100%. It was in your eyes. It was like, you're just you. And I'm not sure that a lot of people see human beings in that way, but that's how
I definitely don't think humans are as kind of, well, I mean, I think we're very adaptable in lots of ways. So obviously as children, we adapt to the environment that we're raised in very much. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily explain everything. I don't know. It's interesting. Like years ago, I did a values exercise where I was sort of, looking at sort of what my core values are. And interestingly, optimism is one of them. And it's funny, most people don't really understand why you might have that as a value. But for me, optimism is what has allowed me to take risks in my life. And it doesn't matter that maybe not all of the risks have really paid off or panned out, certainly not as exactly as how I imagined they would. I mean, I am divorced for a start, didn't mention that. That was not planned. But that doesn't mean that that those risks weren't important ones to take just because they didn't turn out how I thought. But without optimism, I would be paralyzed. I wouldn't be able to take the risks that I've taken. I wouldn't have been able to, I wouldn't be able to take the action that I have been able to take in my life if I didn't feel optimistic. And that's not to say that I am a kind of all sunshines and rainbows person, because I'm really not at all, actually. I really find sort of toxic positivity really grating. And it was something I had to be really careful about the tone of the book, because I do believe in the innate goodness of people, and I do believe people are doing the best they can, and I do believe in offering yourself self-compassion and stuff. But that doesn't mean that really terrible things don't also happen, and those things sit side by side. And so I don't believe in sugarcoating necessarily. I sort of like talking about things in quite plain, straightforward ways. But at the same time, a sense of hopefulness is what drives action. And I think particularly in the world that we're in now, with the kind of challenges we're facing as a species, we have to have hope, because otherwise we won't have action. And we are at a point as a species that that there has to be action. And so I can't imagine my life without an optimistic outlook in that sense.
You seem to see it as part of this feeling of growth, it's a growth experience. So the difficult experiences that you've had, or the decisions you've made, maybe where things didn't go as you maybe would have expected, brought growth nonetheless. That I feel is kind of an important distinction.
Yeah, I do. But I also, again, coming back to this, I don't really like the whole toxic positivity thing. It doesn't mean that I'm glad that some of those things happened. I was thinking about this recently, just with the kind of recent 2-year anniversary of the first lockdown, and how my life has changed over that time. A lot of really good things have happened in the past couple of years because I've been forced to make changes in my life, and changes that I'm now really happy about. But that doesn't mean I feel good about what's happened the past 2 years, because it's been a like really awful, painful process. So yeah, I think it's a bit, in a way, tricky to talk about in that sense. I think who was it that said, I think it was Kathy Rensenbrink, who's a amazing author who I love, who said something like, humans have this amazing capacity to look at the wreckage of their lives and create meaning from it. It doesn't mean that we're glad that these things happened. It's just that we're human, so things will happen. It just will. And so if we can create some meaning from that, it's a way to move on from those wreckages.
Yeah. Oh, so it feels like it's a mix of like meaning and like surrender and hope, and through all that, finding purpose. And it's actually a fantastic, like I said, map for a way to live. And I think you're really inspiring.
God, it makes me sound like I've really got it sorted. I really don't. I mean, I really, really.
No, but it doesn't. It just feels like you're just really honest. And I think that's something that we need. We need people to be honest about what life really feels like. And I love what you do, and other writers like Clover Stroud, who talk about how unbearably difficult things like grief are, but how they're real, full and rich experiences at the same time.
Yes.
And it is difficult to talk about. Like, it's a difficult thing to talk about pain in that way.
Yeah.
But I think
it's how it feels, though. And it was really wonderful actually reading Clover's latest book, The Red of My Blood, because she writes about grief in a way that felt very familiar to me around the time that I lost my mum. It can be a very, very physical, visceral experience. Yeah. And I had never felt more alive in my life. In a weird kind of way. It just felt like such a stark contrast to my mum not being alive. I felt literally tingling with life, not in a pleasant way, just in a really crazy, intense way. And I think it's because the emotions are so acute and so visceral and very sensory that that you can't help but sort of feel like you're practically vibrating with life in those moments. And I think probably at moments early on in the pandemic, people probably felt like that, and I was living in New York in 2001, 2002, and I was in like down the road when the attacks on the Twin Towers happened. And it was a feeling that I had around then. It was actually only just a year and a half after my mum had died. And it felt really similar then, to be in such close proximity to loss and to grief and to a kind of there was a before and afterness to it, where you are completely changed by something, and there's a physicality to it that that's it's really amazing that there are writers out there who can articulate it for all of us.
Yeah, and so beautifully. Yeah, it feels like what we were talking about before the interview about autism, and how it's like the dial of experience and of what it means to be alive is like turned up, really. It's like on full volume. So yeah, I love the way you articulated that. So to finish off, there's a question that I always ask at the end, and I feel like you've already answered it really well in the course of the interview, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So the idea behind the tenderness revolution is as in having this quality of tenderness for ourselves and others, is these 3 C's, because I feel they enable us to sort of fully see the truth about the way things are, and they're courage, curiosity and compassion. And I just wanted to ask, if you had to choose, I know it's incredibly difficult, but if you did have to choose one of these qualities that means the most in your life, what would you choose?
Oh gosh. In a way, I would probably say courage, I think, because I think, I think both curiosity and compassion take courage.
They do.
So I would say that's probably why I would choose that one. And I would say that along with what I was talking about earlier with optimism is the thing that has allowed me to, I guess, take control of what I can control and let go of what I can't. So courage.
Yeah. I think that really fully brings to life, the meaning of courage, like inner courage, and just that it's like you have to have the courage to keep believing that you can take the next step, and that when things completely unexpected things happen, you're going to find a solution. That's like the practical bit, and then you're going to find that kind of real self-compassion around that wraps around all of it, and that enables you to keep giving in the way that you do as a carer, and just as an amazing person. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. I just feel you share so much wisdom, and I really appreciate your book being out there in the world, and just you sharing it and hearing what you have to say around all of this, because it's incredibly important stuff. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so lovely to chat.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Tenderness Revolution. I hope you come back for more, because my aim with this podcast is to help us become more aware of these moments of kindness and compassion and how they shape our lives, and enable us to feel more connected to the world around us.